Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We have today on this episode what we might call a double barrel edition for our listeners. Frequent guest of the show, listeners on the show will be familiar with some of the periodic migration updates that we bring to you, where we connect with our state partners, our waterfowl biologists in some of the states across the country, and in some cases our DU biologist, where we have them provide an update either based on aerial survey numbers or their observations of field or the phone calls they're receiving, just to share with you what we're hearing and what we're seeing with respect to waterfowl migration, waterfowl numbers, habitat conditions. And so on this day, we're recording this on December 20th, and we have a couple of biologists that we're going to reach out to, and we're going to package this into one episode for you. At least that's the plan. And so we are welcoming in first Frank Nelson, wetland ecologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation. Frank was on an episode earlier this year. I believe it was late in November. Frank, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike.
It's good to get you back here, and we're going to keep this a little brief. We in our first visit with you went into a bit more detail about the nature of your aerial surveys, how frequently you conduct those, and how they're conducted. And we're not going to get back into those details. Again, we'll just reference those and have people go back through the archives of the podcast and find those if they want to. So let's just start out and have you tell us when you conducted the most recent survey and what areas you surveyed, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so this week we had all the areas, public managed wetland areas, did a ground survey. We had a couple folks do some aerial flights over north central Missouri, and then I flew over the public lands in southeast Missouri. So we had a mix this week in terms of whether it was ground or aerial.
Okay, and is that the full extent of the areas that you would survey at any time during the winter period? Yeah,
typically we do most of ours are focused primarily on the publicly managed wetlands, those intensively managed wetland areas.
Okay.
And so that's typically what we do. That gives us a good census of what we have in the state overall.
Okay. I'm going to ask you about bird numbers here in a minute, but first I want to get a feel for the habitat conditions that you're seeing out there on the landscape right now.
Sure. Well, and it's definitely changing this week. Earlier this week, we had several inches of ice in northern Missouri as that front came through and brought sleet and snow across, and shallowly flooded areas locked up with ice. Further south, we had skim ice in areas and with open water pockets. Today, temperatures are starting to moderate the last couple of days and getting into the 40s. So more of that habitat starting to free up and have more open water. But there at the beginning of this week, things were starting to get kind of icy for sure. And we started to see some of the birds leaving our areas.
The surveys you conduct are primarily over some of the conservation areas as you described, but as you're flying and as you're doing the ground counts and moving from one location to the next, I'm sure you see a lot of the landscape. You see a lot of private land, a lot of public land. What has the recent weather done in terms of putting shallow water, other additional habitat on the landscape throughout the areas that you frequent? Yeah,
well, river levels in the last month have started to drop, which is the first time in some places like northwest Missouri, and 279 days in northwest Missouri was the last time that the Missouri River was below flood stage. So wow. That was back in March, wow. Which is pretty significant. So some of that floodplain habitat, of course, the water is going back in the ground, being sandy soils and whatnot. So there's been a reduction of habitat in northern Missouri, and then you think about the snow and the ice, that's also reduced the amount of habitat that's available. If you're thinking about southeast Missouri, what I saw, we have a lot of rice, some years between 100 and 200,000 acres in southeast Missouri. And so with these icy temperatures, those shallow fields freeze over pretty easily. And so there's a lot of glass out there when I was flying earlier this week.
Those areas where the water is receding, it's crazy to think that just now that water is starting to recede back into the or out of the floodplain. My guess is those areas that have been flooded for so long were not very productive for ducks this year.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, there were early on, there were some places that did have moist soil that would have typically had crop farmers couldn't get out to. But by and large, I'd say that you're right. There was the duration and repetitive flooding that occurred. There just wasn't a lot of food out there this year, and that's what we kind of experienced. Was it seemed like birds came through. There's lots of water, so they did stop to check things out. But then once they found there wasn't any food, we'd get another front, and birds would push on. And so this year, our numbers kind of peaked right there at the 1st of November and kind of hung out at around 500,000 last 5 weeks. And so it's been really a depressed curve. It's depressing perhaps for some waterfowl hunters as well. There's been some good days out there when the weather's kicked things up. And so people have been successful, but you had to pick your days. And this week, we saw most of our numbers start to fall. Over half of the areas saw their numbers dip. And there's a few areas that were static. And then there's a couple areas that they had seen a dip in the last couple weeks, and they actually saw a bump back up by a couple of thousand birds. But by no means their peak. Their peak was a few weeks ago. So, with this week, we started to kind of come off that plateau and started to dip, which, is what we typically see, second, third week of December, things get pretty frosty up north and we start to see a decline.
Yeah, this is the time of year where you're on the backside of that migration curve on average, I would guess. And
exactly. And it depends on how hard our winters are, because sometimes things will really lock up. The birds will jump over to, say, the Mississippi or the Missouri River, stay where that open water is, so we don't get them on our conservation area counts. And then if it's a fairly short period and things thaw back out, those birds will flop back over to our managed lands. And so we could still have some birds in the area. When it gets really hard, then birds just continue to go, and we'll have to kind of see what happens. Next week it's going to be 50s, 60s almost. Mm-hmm. So things could thaw back out, and we could see a little bit of a resurgence. But we're definitely past the peak, I believe.
Let's talk a bit specifically about the numbers that you saw and the species breakdown. This time of year, you're going to be left with most of the more of the cold hardy birds, cold hardy species. But talk about the numbers that you saw and how they compared to average conditions or average years.
Yeah. Well, across the state, in northern Missouri, it's 95, 99% mallards right now. And even in southeast Missouri, where I flew, it was about 75% mallards. We also had quite a few gadwall, of course, and pintail. There's a few pintail hanging out still, and green wings. And so that's typically what we're seeing across the state is a dominance of mallards. And that's typically what we have at this point is 75 to 90%, depending upon your latitude in the state. And then you've got that mix of gadwalls and green wing teal. And then, there's still some pintail hanging out as well. So, it's definitely a smaller mix of other dabbling ducks.
And what are we talking in terms of numbers? And realizing that we're talking about surveys that are conducted just on a small segment of the overall landscape on which that waterfowl can exploit. But what are the numbers that you saw there?
In Mingo and Duck Creek, or Mingo National Wildlife Refuge and Duck Creek Conservation Area, they're connected at the hip, so their numbers kind of trade back and forth. But within the Mingo Basin, it's about 40,000 ducks there. 10 Mile Pond had about 60,000 ducks, and Tuna Island is down by Arkansas on the Black, and they had about 20,000 in their refuge, and then Otter Slough had about 40,000. So I was encouraged there's more ducks in southeast Missouri than I had anticipated. I was just this year hasn't been that strong, so that's not necessarily the highest benchmark that those areas have had, but it's definitely better than it could be considering the year. So other areas across the state, it varies. Like I said, they've been, as you go further north, of course, some of those areas have been losing birds. Others it seems like birds swap out a little bit. Say the Golden Triangle around Swan Lake, Fountain Grove, and Grand Pass. More birds are kind of consolidating on Swan Lake, and where Grand Pass doesn't have as many. And so you'll see some of that regional transition between birds, but then there's other locations that are just, only a few thousand. So it kind of varies. And that's why I kind of like to, depending upon the region, that statewide, you can kind of get these trends in terms of what's going on.
I've seen some reports on social media suggesting that there are still a fair number of birds north of you guys, even into Iowa and maybe northern Illinois, and maybe even on some of the river systems in South Dakota. And I don't know how much, how credible any of those reports are, and I actually don't recall the date on which I saw those when they were posted. But would that surprise you this time of year, given the cold front that we've had come through, if there'd still be appreciable number of mallards still north of you, mainly on the rivers?
Yeah, I can't speak to anything like of what those numbers may be, but I would be kind of surprised just in the fact that how early we had winter weather up north and the successive fronts that we have had this year. I mean, it was the first or second week of November that we started transition to mallards at a high rate, it was three weeks earlier than we typically do. Typically, we start to see that 60% mallards around Thanksgiving, and we were seeing that the first week of November. So, I've wanted to hope that there was more birds further north, and there very well may be some really cold-hardy ducks that are hanging out on that open water. And if so, that's great. One of the challenges, I think, is the scale. You've got millions of waterfowl, and where are they and how are they distributed? It's really hard to get a feel about how much is left further north of you. And so I think that's a challenge for biologists and waterfowl hunters alike.
Yeah, and I could see a post that someone or someone could go out and count 10,000 mallards in eastern Iowa on one of the rivers there, and that looks like a lot of birds at that right. Single location. But when you compare that to the millions of birds that are throughout the rest of the flyway, that's just a small percentage, and so that's where the scale effect really rears its head in understanding what is that? What do those 10,000 birds mean relative to the distribution of the other birds? And it's really hard to get a feel for that. But we're going to have Aaron Yetter on after this. That's the other part of this particular episode we're going to package together. And so that'll give us a chance to look over across the east side of the Mississippi River and see what they observed this week.
Yeah, that'll be interesting because, or actually after the survey on Monday, we noticed a decline of birds on Ted Shanks, which they had been holding quite a few. And so that's one of the questions. Did they go flip on the other side of the river to Delaware National Wildlife Refuge, or did they keep moving south? So that'll be interesting. You can ask him on your next interview.
What's the name of that refuge across the river that they might have gone to?
Delaware.
Okay. And was there an opening of a hunting season in Missouri that could have influenced that, or were you all open throughout that time? Okay. All right.
Yeah. No, it got really, really cold, and that was on Tuesdays when they saw a shift of birds leaving the area. And it was pretty significant in terms of the number that were in the refuge Tuesday compared to what was there on Monday.
A couple of final questions here for you, Frank. What about geese? Do y'all enumerate those during your surveys?
Yeah, we do pick them up on our counts and do include them. However, because of their distribution, not necessarily needing, the shallow water habitat and being able to forage quite a bit more out in the fields, it's not a good estimate on their abundance.
Yeah.
We have been getting more Canada geese, and then the snow geese this year. It's really hard to make sense out of. Definitely, we have picked them up the last couple weeks. Lust Bluffs had quite a few, I think 50,000 geese last week, but they had very few this week. And then, but then I saw quite a few. Well, there's about 10,000 snows around Otter Slough, and then they were dotted around in flocks of several thousand, here and there across the rice country in southeast Missouri. So they are moving through. The general buildup that we typically see this year, I don't know, we've had flight days when they're passing through along with white fronts, but not the buildup that we typically see. So, yeah, it's one of those that it's been nagging me in the back of my mind, like what's going on with the geese this year. But we do pick them up, but like I said, it's not our counts. I don't feel is a good estimate just because of the distribution across the landscape.
That's the sentiment I get with most every other biologist that I speak with. Their tendency to cluster to a much higher degree than do ducks makes them much more difficult to survey in an effective and accurate manner, unless you really put forth a lot of effort. And I can say that I've heard snow geese flying overhead, flying from west to east here in southwestern Tennessee, which kind of surprised me a little bit. But I'm new here, and so I'm sure there'll be a lot of experiences that will intrigue me as I hear them.
Yeah, no, yeah. Yesterday was interesting. It's not. I saw quite a few geese flying around in the air as we were. It's not something you see every time you do a survey, and there was quite a few. I'd confirm that. I mean, I wasn't as far as the goose flies, not too far from where you were the other day.
Yeah, that's true.
And there was quite a few geese in the air and kind of flying in strings. So, that's. I'd say there may have been a little bit of a movement yesterday with the snow geese. Anyway,
what are the dates of the waterfowl season there? I should say the duck season. Y'all have a few weeks remaining, right?
Yeah, the North Zone is closing up here shortly. The North Zone will be closed on December 31st. Our Middle Zone, we are extending into January 12th. Duck hunters about 5 years ago, wanted to see what hunting was like in January, so they'll get a chance to experience that another year. And then the South Zone goes all the way to the end at January 31st. And so we'll be wrapping up our regs and re-looking at that. So that'll be something for our hunters to be, bringing up their we want to hear from them and their opinions at our workshops as well as our postseason surveys. So So those regulations change every 5 years, so we can update and kind of try to fit the best of what people want and how to utilize the resource.
Very good. Well, I encourage the hunters of your state to participate in those surveys, participate in those workshops, and voice their thoughts, their opinions. Let them be heard. That's a good thing. What about your goose season? Does it go a little later into the month?
Yes, that's correct. Our geese season goes to February 6th, and that's for white fronts and Canada geese as well as our light geese. And then the conservation order on light geese goes from February 7th to April 30th.
Well, folks have a few more weeks in the case of duck season, and nearly a couple of additional months and actually several months when it comes to the light goose hunting to get out there and enjoy the resource. So we certainly encourage you to do that. And I know, Frank, y'all have a few more surveys, or at least one more survey to conduct. You'll be participating in the midwinter survey, right? Yep.
So there's time left in the season for folks to get out, definitely in January. So hopefully folks can take advantage of the conditions and get out there and enjoy a few days in the field.
Well, we're going to leave it there, Frank. We appreciate very much you joining us today and sharing this information. And thanks for being a friend of the show. And personally, wish you and your family a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And we'll catch you in 2020.
Sounds good. Thanks. I appreciate it.
The Ducks Unlimited Expo, May 15th, 16th, and 17th, 2020 at the Texas Motor Speedway in Fort Worth, Texas. Interactive villages, shooting, archery, dogs, fishing, kayak, canoe, 4x4 off-road tracks, ATV, UTV track, industry experts, demonstrations, exhibitors, and more. The Ducks Unlimited Expo, everything outdoors. The ultimate playground for the outdoor enthusiast. The Ducks Unlimited Expo. Visit www.duckexpo.com.
Now we're going to move into part 2 of this special migration update episode. We're bringing in Aaron Yetter, waterfowl ecologist with the Forbes Biological Station, Illinois Natural History Survey. Aaron joined us a few weeks back, also maybe about a month ago, to introduce us to the surveys that they conduct in the western and southern portion of Illinois. And so we're not going to, as we did with Frank, we're not going to rehash the details of those surveys. We'll reference refer our listeners back to those original podcast episodes with Aaron, and you can get that information there. We're going to just get a brief update on what Aaron saw in the most recent survey. So, Aaron, thanks for joining us, and welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you for having us.
Absolutely. I don't know that I've seen a post yet on the results from your most recent survey. So I believe this is hot off the press. So why don't we start by you telling us when these surveys were conducted and remind us of the areas over which they were conducted.
Okay. So you just missed it while you were talking to Frank. I just posted my blog for the week,
okay.
So the numbers just went out. So our survey is we consider ourselves one of the longest running waterfowl surveys in North America. Belrose started them in 1948 and they've been flown every year since then. All but 2001, we couldn't get a pilot. So we're finishing up our 71st year of the surveys. And we fly the Illinois River from the Big Bend in the river at Hennepin all the way down to the confluence at Grafton with the Mississippi River. And then from the Mississippi Grafton all the way up to Port Louisa, which is a part of the Upper Mish National Wildlife Refuge. Just below the Quad Cities.
Okay. And you flew these surveys earlier this week. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I flew it on the 18th on Wednesday.
The surveys are restricted to public land. Is that right? State and federal. You don't bring any private land into the survey. Do I remember that correctly?
No. That we do have some private refuges. But most of it is state and federal refuges. But the Emmequon Preserve is owned by the Nature Conservancy and the Fish and Wildlife Service together, and then there's several private duck clubs. Grand Island on the Illinois River is one of the refuges or a couple of the refuges we count, and Darden and Quiver are big hunting clubs on the Mississippi River that we count as well.
Okay, that's the simultaneous beauty and challenge of doing these surveys with so many different state waterfowl biologists, is that eventually I'll get all this figured out, but right now I'm going to get a few things wrong here and there, so thanks for clarifying that. We'll start out with you the same way we did with Frank. Give us some general impressions and observations of what you saw in this most recent survey with respect to habitat conditions.
Ice, and more ice. Where everything is pretty much frozen up, greater than 90% on most of the areas. Even Pool 19 of the Mississippi River had greater than 90%
wow.
ice. So it was the birds are all, the ones that are left are all tightly packed into some holes that they're keeping open just due to their numbers.
Okay. Well, let's jump right into the numbers in that case. I'm pretty sure that you're going to tell me that most of what you saw were mallards, but give me the details.
Yeah, the Illinois River is mallards. We're down 50% from the 10-year average and 22% from last week. There's a couple of straggler canvasbacks and golden eyes and common mergansers and those types of things, but we're basically mallards on the Illinois. The Mississippi River mallards were down 21% from last week and 5% below average, about 216,000 of those on the Mississippi. And total ducks on the Mississippi were about 238,000, which is down 30% from last week and almost 40% from average.
If weather conditions, temperatures specifically, kind of stayed the way they are right now, I'm actually not sure what your high and low temperatures are, but I know what ours in Memphis at this latitude are going to be. But given this forecast that we're seeing for the next couple of weeks, do you expect numbers to sort of stay the same where you are, or do you expect them to slowly decline?
Well, we're coming out of a cold snap. It's been lows of 18 to 19 in central Illinois here for the last 4 or 5 days, and highs were most recently in the right around 30. So we've been below freezing for 4 or 5 days, but today we're up into almost 40, I believe. So it's starting to thaw out, and we're supposed to be above normal temperatures till the forecast is through the end of the year. So we might thaw out, but I doubt that there will be any birds, at least on the Illinois River. I doubt there's any new birds to come. And the Mississippi River, there may be some bounce back, but there's pretty low numbers, as I'm sure Frank told you, even down in the southern tip of Missouri. So I don't think there's a whole lot of bounce back to make their way back up here.
Yeah, but you would probably expect to see some of those birds that you have right now kind of stick around unless they're pushed farther south due to another significant cold snap, right?
Yeah, I don't think I think we'll start thawing out now. It'll take several days because I'm sure that ice is 2 or 3 inches thick by now. And even with temperatures approaching 50, I think we're still going to be frozen for a few more days, and I don't think there's any more birds to come. I think we're stuck with the birds that we got.
Frank did want me to ask you about one particular location. I think he referred to it as Del Air Refuge, and I think they have a conservation area, or one of the areas that they survey is just on the other side of the river from that refuge, and he described a pretty significant decrease in the number of birds on their side of the river, and he was kind of wondering if those birds might have hopped over to the east side. Do you have those numbers? Do you know if that's where the birds went?
Right around Louisiana, Missouri, Clarksville area, there's 4 pretty big refuges, or 4 or 5. There's Ted Shanks State Conservation Area in Missouri, and then there's Clarence Cannon National Wildlife Refuge in Missouri. There's Towhead Lake, which is a private club right outside of Del Air, and then Del Air itself. And most everything was frozen this week, except Del Air was holding about 70,000 birds, 68,000.
Okay.
So a lot of the birds from Shanks must have hopped over to the river at Del Air, and a bunch of the birds at Clarence Cannon probably came up as well, because those areas were 99% ice.
Oh, okay. Well, that is consistent with what he was suspecting may have happened. I also know that Larry Reynolds in Louisiana released the results from their December survey. I think in certain parts of that state they were unable to fully complete the survey due to some variety of factors. But if I remember correctly, they definitely had an increase in their duck numbers from their most recent November survey, and I think their numbers were just about on par with the most recent 10-year average. So they saw a pretty significant bump in ducks down at that latitude. And so, yeah, we're starting to get somewhat of a picture of where these birds are and what they're doing. And now we just need the weather. The southern hunters need the weather to cooperate to get the birds moving around. What we don't need, if you're a hunter, is a stagnating weather pattern. And so, yeah, let's just hope we get something other than that. And speaking of hunting seasons, I think your season up there, maybe in the northern part of the state's got to be coming to a close. What about the other portions of your state? Where do you sit with respect to your waterfowl season, your duck seasons right now?
Sure. So because Illinois is such a long north to south state, we have 4 zones, and the north zone closed on December 17th. The central zone where I'm at in Havana it closes on Christmas Eve, so December 24th. The South Central Zone closes on January 7th, and the South Zone, the furthest one, goes all the way to the 26th of January.
Okay. So the hunters in your state, certainly the more southern part of the state, still have a few weeks left to get out and chase some ducks, and then your goose season is going to go a little farther into January. And does it go into February at all?
No, it closes. The North Zone will close for geese on January 16th. However, the Central, South, and South Central zones go all the way to the end of the framework at January 31st.
Still some opportunities out there, and we'll encourage folks to find some time to get in the blind and enjoy the resource and enjoy the fruits of our collective labor. And anything else that we need to wrap up with here, Aaron?
It's been a crazy year. A lot of the hunters and in the big clubs even have reported a pretty dismal harvest, I guess. There's been days that are good, and even so now, some of the days you can go out and shoot some birds, and other days it's just a bluebirder with nothing. So I would bet we'll find that this season was a below average harvest for the state of Illinois.
Frank was sharing with us a similar thought, and he attributed some of their, he described basically the same thing you did, that there were some days where people were very successful, but it seems as though those days might have been fewer and farther between, and he attributed that to potentially the strong cold front that came through very early, and that seems to have maybe caused a fair number of birds to skip right on through their state. The other thing that he mentioned relative to what he saw in Missouri is that there were so many areas, so much of the landscape had stayed flooded throughout the summer and was not allowed to really produce any valuable waterfowl food. So although some ducks might have settled around for a little while, they quickly figured out that there's not much food resource there. So he described a much flatter migration curve this year than what they typically see. So it might have been some of the same that y'all were seeing.
Yeah, we found the same thing, that we actually, the Illinois River went out in the first week of August, and it stayed down pretty much until the first or week or so of October, and then we got a big bump in water again, and then so we actually got some food on the Illinois, the Mississippi, and at least where I survey, I think they had some pretty good food in areas that weren't protected, but then we got that October flood that just really took away a bunch of the food that was here, and the water was flooded, or the food was flooded too deep on many areas for the dabbling ducks to utilize. And then the Veterans Day storm that rolled in, we had 5-degree temperatures that night or the next night, I can't remember, but right around there we froze pretty hard, and that sent all of our ducks south.
That'll push the majority of those less cold hardy species right on out of your state more times than not.
The last thing to note was that I never did see the big numbers of canvasbacks on pool 19 this year. I don't know where they're at, if they're in Catahoula Lake or Louisiana, but they definitely didn't stop over here for very long, and I didn't ever have a count of very big numbers on them.
I don't think they would all be on Catahoula, but I know Larry has told us that they saw good numbers of canvasbacks on Catahoula Lake, and I actually don't recall the numbers of canvasbacks specifically that he recorded during this most recent survey, but I know he described good habitat conditions or water levels at their management target for Catahoula Lake still. So I think that area is doing pretty good for ducks. But I don't know on the canvasback story. Maybe we'll figure that one out once we get to the midwinter survey. Maybe there will be a hotspot come out among some of the states that participate in that survey. Certainly will be interesting. And so you guys, speaking of that, y'all participate in the midwinter, and do you have any additional survey between now and then do you have one after that?
No, the midwinter is my last. So we start our flights the first week of September, and there's the first week or two of October we take off, but I fly 17 weeks consecutive in the
Wow.
fall, from September to the midwinter inventory in the first full week of January. And then our surveys resume in the spring from around Valentine's Day or whenever we thaw out, and for 8 weeks until the middle of April.
Okay. Well, we might have you on in the spring to talk about those surveys. I think I forgot that you conducted those, but that would be something of interest. And I think I can probably say that unless we see a major change in the weather pattern, and given what you've described to me with respect to the amount of ice that y'all are seeing and the low number of birds, there's probably not going to be a big change in what you see between now and the midwinter. So this might be the last time that we have you on the show this year, Aaron, to talk about bird numbers.
Yeah, I don't anticipate much to change from here. So
we do appreciate you coming on the podcast with us and sharing this information. I do think this is something that we'll continue to do in subsequent years, and thank you for sharing your time, and thank you for sharing this information. I know it's of interest to our listeners, and we hope that they're picking up some good pieces of insight from it.
You're welcome. Thanks, Mike, and thanks for having us on the air.
Absolutely. And on a personal note, wishing you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, Aaron. Thanks again.
Merry Christmas to all of you. Bye-bye.
We extend a special thanks to our guest on this show, Frank Nelson with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and Aaron Yetter with the Illinois Natural History Survey. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for doing the great work that he does to get these podcasts out to you, our listeners. And to you, our listeners, we thank you for joining this podcast and listening to us. We know you have a choice in how you spend your time, and we thank you for spending it with us. We do want to end this year, or end this podcast, by wishing you a Merry Christmas, wishing you a Happy New Year, and we look forward to spending many hours with you in the new year as well. And so thank you for your commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.